IWW was a combined effort of UWW and the Inquiry Program. We never were officially sanctioned by the Faculty Senate. We just put two compatible programs together. UWW was admitting people with 2 years of college behind them, and people who didn't have any college behind them or hadn't completed some form of gen ed were having difficulty because of the rigidity of the university demands.
And when the courses were offered.
And the courses weren't even offered.
These were working people, and they had a hard time finding the gen ed courses that were, that were available to them, they could take after work.
Yeah, because the whole assumption of colleges in those days was you were resident or you were a commuter and you came during the day. Inquiry Program was an alternative to that gen ed. We had our own curriculum. The curriculum amounted in those days to 4 courses. They carried each 4 credits, so that was a much lower credit requirement.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to give fair amount of credit to off-campus experiences, our undergraduate gen ed equivalent of prior learning.
Mm-hmm.
So UWW students could do that. We offered our classes at night. And we guided the UWW students to faculty who would be compatible with their needs and interests. I called them IWWs, Wobblies, because it was Inquiry and WW. We did that for 5 or 6 years?
I think about 6. I think we started in 1980.
Yeah.
And then we moved over. It could have been more like 7 or 8 years, because we moved to the School of Ed in 1988.
Yeah,
and
well, we were in the School of Ed in 81. But our base, where the programs were housed and administratively didn't affect what we were doing academically.
Right.
And those were exciting times. My gen ed classes, my modes of inquiry classes, had 3 distinct populations. There were the fresh out of high school, first year or second year, living on campus students. There was a population of, I called them young adults, late 20s, early 30s, maybe into the late 30s. And then there was an older contingent in their 40s, even into their 50s, and occasionally a student in the 60s. But so there were 3 populations who had 3 different kinds of experiences, and those were very exciting classes.
Mm-hmm.
Very exciting classes. First, I would describe what they all have in common. Latin, German, history, American literature. That was sophomore year, Mr. Crockett. Senior literature, Mrs. Heffernan and Mr. Loud, the chemist. What they all had 3 characteristics: passion, love, and humility. Didn't matter. Cross the disciplines. I have to say, all this conversation that comes from me is like a prior learning portfolio for UWW.
Right.
It's not thoughts that I necessarily consciously had at the time. It's synthesizing my experience from, in this case, a way distant future. They shared that. It, recognized by all of us. They loved their material. They loved teaching their material, and they had a humility both as teachers and as human beings. So Mrs. Heffernan had us sit in a big square defined by these long academic tables, so there was a Grand Canyon of space between us. Mr. Crockett stood behind a lectern, almost never left behind the lectern. Mrs. Snell in history couldn't stop walking. She was so excited she just sort of circulated through the universe. Mr. Loud stood mostly by his table, the lab table at the front of the science room. And Mr. Goodrich had a tipping back office chair, and we were often looking at his feet. And so each one of them, very different structural, physical appearance, but they all had these things in common. And they were all living human beings. We didn't know if they were married, not married, had children. We didn't know about their person, except as it affected in the classroom. And they were real people. Mrs. Heffernan knew how to get us laughing and to calm us down, because we were a pretty rowdy bunch. So, despite the subject matter, despite their age, that's the kind of thing they all had in common. And it was infectious. Even people who didn't like the course, in terms of, who wants to read Hawthorne, or chemistry, wow, boo. We all knew these teachers loved what they were doing. I don't think any of them had doctorates. I knew some of them had masters, but, what they had was a love of the material, a passion for sharing it, a love of the students. They really wanted us to learn and find out things, and they were humble. They were not telling us this is the way the world wags.
It never came up. Teaching never came up in grad school. It was all about the content. It was all about the things we were reading and preparing for becoming faculty. But the emphasis wasn't on teaching, on the students. It was on research and publication and that sort of thing. So we didn't really, I don't think anyone in graduate school ever talked to me about teaching. And some of them never learned anything themselves. When you get into graduate school, at least in those days, it was really about preparing to be a faculty member, at least in English, which is what I was in, and it was much more focused on the content, what we were reading, what it meant, what we were, and we'd have conversations about the literature, and some of them were wonderful, but no one ever talked to me about teaching and what I needed to know in order to be a good teacher. So I had to learn it another way.
Well, I had a similar and slightly different experience. I started out in a master's program at Bredlow School of English, which meets in the summers, and it draws faculty from all over the country. They just come in to teach their one course for the 6 weeks of and if you did 5 years of summer study, you got a master's in English. So there was a whole variety of older and younger from Yale, from Princeton, from Brown, from Simmons, all over the place. And there was a range of styles, but it was all very formal. And the target student population was high school English teachers who were already teaching high school English. They had their teaching certificate, but wanted to get a master's degree for a variety of reasons. And, we had this extraordinary good luck of taking courses with people at the peak of their career. So I went from that to a doctoral program, but my program was slightly different from yours because it was in theater, and they purposely admitted 4 of us a year who were older. I was the baby at 29 of my 4, who had professional or semi-professional theater experience. And the point was to combine theater work with the scholarship.
Nice. Yeah.
And they did a pretty good job of that. So there wasn't an emphasis, there was no reference to teaching it, right? That was just assumed you were going to work on a college faculty and you would teach.
Right.
Go to it, kid.
Yeah.
But there was an emphasis on everything we were doing somehow fed into theater, performance.
So there was a real experiential component to it. Yeah.
Right. I was a designer. Everybody else was a director and an actor. It was a light designer. Very weird for somebody in a doctoral program. Most of them are directors or actors who have become directors. But again, there was a range of styles, personality. Some were quite awful. Some were just absolutely mind-boggling. You just want to sit there and listen.
Once I left graduate school, I had no intention of going back into education. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to travel. I was a musician, and I wanted to. I was writing songs and playing in a group, and then we moved from Illinois to Massachusetts, and I really needed a job. And there was a CETA-funded job development program for youth in the area, and this was the Fitchburg area where we were living at the time. And I applied for it, and my master's degree came in handy. I got the job. I had never taught anything in my life. I hadn't had a teaching assistantship or anything like that in graduate school. And the CETA legislation made it possible, even though it was a job training program, made it possible for the kids in the program to get a certain amount of academic education that would go along with, the job training that they were doing. So I became the teacher, and I remember the first group of kids. There were 3 kids, and they came in, and I said, "Well, what do you want to learn?" And they said, "Well, we need to know some math," because they were all in a carpentry program, and so they need. And their carpentry teachers were saying, "Well, you really need to know a little math in order to do this." So they came in, and we started talking, and they told me what they wanted to do, and I got really interested in them as people and what they started with 3 kids, and we just talked, And I said, well, I'm not great in math, but I can, teach you a few things. And I said, are there any other kids in the job training program that you know that might be interested in learning more about math, learning more about writing? Are they interested in getting a GED? These were all dropouts, all these kids. Or they were dropouts and were remanded by the courts to the job training program. So some of them were pretty tough kids, and most of them were just kids who didn't like school. And so they talked to the kids who were in their programs. These kids were all in carpentry, but there were two carpentry groups. There were two auto repair groups, and there was a landscaping group. And they had, boys and girls in all of them. And the next time we got together, there were 12 kids. I said, oh, there's something really going on here. So I went to my boss and said, I think we need a room, because I was doing it just sort of in a corridor someplace. They didn't expect many kids would be interested in the academic education. And so they gave me a room in Fitchburg that was in terrible shape. And one time we were working, by then I had about 15 kids, and we were working and the ceiling fell down. And so I said, we really could use a better place. And meanwhile, I was learning more from them than they were learning from me, because I was learning about what their experiences in education had been. Mostly unhappy. And I was also learning that they really wanted to learn. They just didn't like school. And so I was trying to figure out, because I had never taught anybody anything, and so I was trying to figure out how I could work with them the best way. And it wasn't by getting a math book, and saying, okay, we're going to follow this book, go buy it. And so we started every morning by just talking. What have you been doing in carpentry? What have you been doing in auto mechanics? Or what do you want to do? Where do you see yourself in the future? And they started to open up more and more. And then when we got to this larger room, the group leaders in carpentry and landscaping, anyway, would meet their kids at the school where I was working. And so then we'd all sit around and talk for a while before they went off to their jobs. And they kept saying, the crew chiefs kept saying, you really got to take advantage of this, and you could get your GED while you're in this program. And so anyway, the number of kids started to multiply. And then we started to work so that the crew chiefs could go off and get really good jobs for their kids to do in the community while the kids were in the education program. And then, so we had the one carpentry crew chief built greenhouses, geodesic domes. It's really interesting projects for these kids to learn on. Meanwhile, the number of kids kept growing, and so they grew out of this next room that we had. And so I noticed that there was a derelict elementary school in Fitchburg that hadn't been used for about 10 years, had been closed up. And I went to the boss and said, could we write a grant proposal to fix this place up and make it the work experience program school? And he said, sure. So I wrote a proposal. We got $100,000 to rehab this thing. The kids did all the work themselves, with the crew chief, and both carpentry crews were working on this project. They did a really nice job. And meanwhile, we hired 2 more teachers. So at one point we had about 40 kids in the program. They weren't all coming at the same time, and some of them just wanted to learn a little writing and a little math. And some of them, and more of them, said, as long as I'm here, why don't I get my GED? And so, you know, over the course of 4.5 years, we got 175 kids their GEDs. And the teaching what I learned about teaching in that process is that it's not about the content nearly as much as it's about the attitude that you have towards learning. And these kids really wanted to learn. And we, afterwards, the group, the teachers and the crew supervisors would go out and have a beer, and we'd talk about what the kids needed, what they wanted, what we could give them, you know. And it was a very exciting time. What I learned was none of us knew anything about education. We finally hired a couple of teachers who actually had been taking education courses, but we didn't know anything about education. But what we did do, and what I learned was the thing to do, we paid attention to the kids, paid attention to what they responded to, how they responded, and their interests. And that made all the difference. The program finally fell apart because the boss wanted to double the number of kids in the program without changing the number of staff. And I said, and the 3 of us went to talk to him and said, you know, this is a big mistake because these kids really need, you can't put them all in a group of 30 and lecture to them. You know, you've got to have a relationship. And at that point we had about a 3 students to 1, you know, teacher or crew supervisor, and it was working. It was really working well. And he wouldn't budge. He wanted to do it. We had the program itself had acquired a certain reputation in the whole CETA organization. We'd done some interesting things, and they'd gotten noted. And so he, I think, wanted to expand on it. And you know, some of it had to do with his own ambitions. And 6 months later, the program folded. And I was gone by then because I had gone back to talk to him. And we had a pretty heated argument, and at the end of it he said, well, you can't be director of the school anymore. You can stay as a teacher, but I can't work with you. And so I said, well, it's time for me to go. 4.5 years. And then I fortunately got a job at UWW, which was, from there, and that was exactly the place for a guy like me to go after after that. Yeah. So I was very fortunate, but that's how I learned about teaching, and it really served me well in UWW. I don't think I could have been a regular English faculty member. I don't think it would have worked for me at all. The way I saw what could be done, you know, with working with students, and it was really working with those kids. It wasn't only kids. We had there was also within that CETA group, there was a homemaker reentry program, and so we had some older women who were also coming to the group, and that was very interesting to see some of these older women talking to these young kids and telling them, you better straighten out, you know, or else, you know, I know, I've been there. It was just, it was really fascinating. And we got connected with, there's several towns and cities in the CETA consortium that went all the way from Fitchburg to Athol. And we got credit sharing arrangements with all of the schools in those towns, so that if a kid came into the program, dropped out of school, came into the program, the amount of time that kid spent with us could be applied to their education if they went back to school.